Hi everyone, this is Dr. TS, and today's video is going to be the start of our final module for Unit 2, where we are going to be talking about tissues. So far in Unit 2, we've been talking about macromolecules and cells and cell transport. So now I want to talk about what happens when a bunch of cells come and work together. So because this is a human biology class and because we are studying humans, which are multicellular organisms made up of tissues and organs, I think it's really important that you guys understand the basics of what tissues are made out of. So if you kind of remember our hierarchy at the very beginning, we had like atoms made elements, which make macromolecule or molecules, which make macromolecules, which go into cells. Right above cells are tissues. And that's what this module today is going to be focused on. And we're specifically going to focus on the type of tissues that we find in humans. So there's plant tissues, there's other animal tissues. These are going to be the type of tissues that we see in humans. So let's talk first a little bit about the basics of tissues. Tissues are defined as a group of cells that are working together for a specific function. So these are all cells that are going to have a similar function to them. So maybe you have liver cells that are all going to be filtering and making lipids, right? Or you have heart cells that are working together to pump your heart. These are cells that are working together for a specific function. And these tissues then form larger organs. So lung cells will form the lung, ovarian cells form the ovaries, brain cells form the brain. So these tissues will form organs or organ systems. And there are four major types of tissues that we're going to talk about: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. So today's mini lecture is going to be kind of on the basics of tissues, and we'll talk about epithelial, and then you'll have separate lectures for connective, muscle, and nervous. So let's kind of talk first about the building blocks of tissues. So cells are made up of three things, or tissues are made up of three things: cells, extracellular matrix, and cell junctions. So we've talked a lot about cells, right? Cells that come in all different types of shapes and sizes. But what's important to note, right, whenever we typically draw a cell, you often draw a circle, right, a nucleus in there, since we're talking about a eukaryotic organism. But it's important to note that cells come in lots of different shapes and sizes, and that structure will dictate function. This is a thing that you're going to hear a lot in this class. Structure dictates tissue function. So for example, lung cells tend to be very flat, right? That's really good for gas exchange. And if you think about the function of the lungs, right, gas exchange is really important. Another example I have here, right, if we think about our muscle tissue, our skeletal muscle tissue, the muscles that help move our bones, these are going to be, you're going to need a lot of energy in these types of cells. You're going to need lots of mitochondria, lots of nuclei. These cells need to be tightly packed together. And so you often see them be very striated and packed tightly together. So the structure of the cell often dictates the tissue function. So regardless of where you are in the body, if you think about the function of an organ, you also want to think about what types of cells you would want and what you would want them to look like. The next building block of tissues are the extracellular matrix. The extracellular matrix is a bunch of non-cellular material that surrounds cells. So we've talked about cell junctions, and I'll mention that on the next slide, but extracellular matrix is a bunch of stuff that cells secrete to kind of help support the surrounding area. And this is often made up of secreted macromolecules, so carbohydrates, lipids, proteins that help support the surrounding cell. And different types of tissues are going to have different amounts of this extracellular matrix. So for example, connective tissue often has much more extracellular matrix than skeletal tissue does. And finally, the last kind of basic building block of a tissue are cell junctions. And we've already talked about these in our module about cells, but remember, these are multi-protein complexes that are going to help the cell in multiple ways. It's going to help with adhesion, sealing, and communication between cells. So we've talked about tight junctions, which help kind of prevent leakage between two cells. We have gap junctions, which are going to be really important for communication, so how two cells can talk to each other. And we also talked about desmosomes, which are really important in resisting mechanical stress or the movement of cells against each other. So all tissues are kind of made up of different combinations of cells, extracellular matrix, and cell junctions, all working together in and eventually what becomes an organ. So the first type of tissue that we want you guys to understand is epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue is made up of densely packed cells with a very little extracellular matrix. And epithelial tissues act as our liners. So this is going to line all external and internal body systems. So the biggest piece of epithelial tissue we have is our skin. So if you think about the function of our skin, it exists to be watertight, waterproof, right? It keeps things from the outside getting in. So think about epithelial tissue. They're going to be really tightly packed together. There's not going to be a lot of extracellular matrix. It's lining the insides of organs. It's lining our skin. And it's really important to keeping things separate from one another. So let's talk a little bit about some of the functions of epithelial tissues. The first is protection. This is going to be our body's first line of defense against physical, chemical, and biological damage. So again, our skin is protecting the rest of our body from bacteria, from other germs, from chemicals, right? Every time you're touching something out in the real world, your skin is acting as a protectant from whatever you're interacting with. Epithelial tissue is also really important for permeability. This is going to be controlling what our body absorbs. So our skin cells are permeable to certain things. So we have to be careful about what things we're touching and when we have to wear gloves. This is important in organ linings, right? If we're talking about the lining of the stomach, right, made up of intestinal issues, right? We want certain things to be able to get out of the stomach and certain things to stay in. So the epithelial tissue is really going to control permeability. It's going to control what's coming in and out of that certain area. Finally, some epithelial tissues are really important for a function called secretion. So some epithelial tissues secrete mucus. So we have epithelial tissues in our nose that makes up our snot. We have some epithelial tissues that release other substances. So going back to kind of the digestive system, our small intestine is lined with a bunch of epithelial tissue that releases enzymes. Remember, enzymes are proteins that do chemical reactions. So if we release a bunch of enzymes, this is going to help break down food. If you think about the function of the small intestine, it's to break down food, get all the nutrients out so that we can do different cellular processes. So epithelial tissues are really essential to protection, permeability, and secretion. There are lots of different types of epithelial tissue, but we kind of distinguish them based on two things. The first is the number of layers. Okay, so how many layers of cells do you have? And we base this using three terms. We have simple, stratified, and pseudostratified. So simple epithelial tissue is just one layer of cells. Stratified is multi-layer, so you have multiple cells stacked on top of each other. Pseudostratified is actually kind of an interesting in-between. Pseudostratified will sometimes look like there's more than one layer, but there isn't. So sometimes you have cells that are kind of oddly shaped, and it can look like there is more than one layer, but there isn't. Additionally, we also distinguish epithelial cells by cell shape, and there are three main shapes that you'll see. First, you'll see squamous. These are very flat and thin cells. Okay, so very thin. Think about like your lung cells. They tend to be very squamous shaped. You have cuboidal, which are cube shaped. So they look like a cube. And then columnar, which are more, as you can imagine, column shaped. So we designate types of epithelial based on the number of layers and their cell shape. So if I told you to draw a stratified cuboidal epithelial tissue, you would think stratified, so I'm going to have multiple layers. Cuboidal means square, so I draw a bunch of squares on top of each other in multiple layers. If I asked you to draw simple columnar, you would draw a single layer of column-shaped cells. So this is kind of the major, most basic distinction between the different types of epithelial tissues. And if you go on to take classes in anatomy and physiology, you'll learn some more specific names and some more specific functions for these types of epithelial tissues. All right, that'll be it for today. Thank you, guys.